Hello, everybody, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 27th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. Still out of the country, still time traveling in these recordings, but I can be reached. I'm on the socials. Come say hi. Twitter, Facebook, less so Facebook, but I am there. Insta, all the good stuff. I'm super excited about this week's episode. I do want to thank those of you who continue to support the show by pledging your weekly support on Patreon. Again, that's patreon.com/talknerdy if you want to learn more. So this week, I want to thank Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Charles Payet, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, and David J.E. Smith. I do apologize if you are a new patron that just pledged your support within the last week or two. I did record this early, so I missed you, but I promise I'll give you a shout out on the next episode. All right, let's talk about this week's show. So I had the opportunity to have a chat with a wonderful science journalist and author. She's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Wired, Nature, all these amazing places. And her newest book is so good. It's called The Great Indoors, The Surprising Science of How Buildings Shape Our Behavior, Health, and Happiness. Absolutely fascinating. So guys, without any further ado, here she is, Emily Anthes. Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So I'm really excited to talk about your newest book, The Great Indoors, The Surprising Science of How Buildings Shape Our Behavior, Health, and Happiness. And interestingly, this is not the first time on Talk Nerdy, and I guess that's to be expected because I've been doing this for so long now, but it's not the first time that I've talked to somebody who has done deep dives into like the interior environment, but I've mostly spoken to scientists who have very specific areas of research, whether it's kind of ergonomic design or whether it is air quality and, you know, the health and wellness that comes from air quality. But you've sort of dug into all sorts of different aspects for your book. I was wondering, did you come across any terms? Like, is there a field of science that has a name now? Or is it still kind of multidisciplinary?
I mean, it's definitely multidisciplinary, but there are a couple of different fields or subfields that it tends to encapsulate depending on what you're talking about. So there is a burgeoning field now known as indoor ecology, which I think is really fascinating. So looking at, you know, the microbes that live in our buildings and the ecosystems that form there. There's also sort of more broadly something that's sometimes called built environment studies or environmental psychology. And then there's sort of the world of evidence-based design, which is more in sort of the architecture and design side, but encapsulates everything that all sorts of disciplines and projects in which designers are using data to inform their designs.
Right. So you've been working as a science journalist. You have training in science journalism. You've been writing for years across several different outlets. What first drew you to say, okay, I have enough interest, because, you know, books take a while, so you got to actually enjoy what you're writing about. So not only like, is this so interesting to me and I'm passionate about it enough that I want to write about it, but also like kind of which of those, I guess, broad categories was your sort of entree into talking about the great indoors?
I would say it was definitely the indoor ecology bit. I was seeing a lot of studies come out 5 or 6 years ago about the indoor microbiome, and researchers were going into homes across the US or hospitals or schools, and they were charting the microbes that live there, that are found in our house dust and in our dishwashers. And I thought it was fascinating on its own, but it also triggered this sort of aha moment for me in which I realized that our indoor spaces and our buildings are ecosystems too. We often think of the outdoors as the quote unquote real world, and that's where nature is and that's where life happens. But there are these really rich and complex ecosystems and landscapes inside our building. And so I started thinking about that from the point of view of microbes and insects and things like that. But that also sort of opened my mind and expanded my thinking in a way that I realized, wait a minute, there's a lot more going on inside our buildings than we often appreciate.
Right. And what's so funny is that, of course, we're not all, but many of us, those of us who either are not essential workers or who happen to be lucky enough and have the privilege enough to have the types of jobs where they did easily translate to adapting and working from home, are now spending the vast majority of our time at home because of this global pandemic. And it's, your book was just published, or actually, yeah, it was just published like a week or two ago as of this recording. There's no way you could have known when you first started working on this that this would be the world that we're living in right now. Have people been asking you a lot about that angle? Kind of like, we're all stuck inside. Like, what does that mean?
Absolutely. And I've actually had a few people ask me what I'm planning to write about next so they can be prepared for whatever happens when my next book comes out. I did not foresee this. It is just a coincidence, but I do think that what's happening right now and all the time we're spending indoors in general and in our homes in particular has made people much more attuned to their indoor environments and the ways that they affect their daily lives. I mean, one of the arguments I make in the book and one of the premises of the book is that our indoor environments matter. And in some ways, I feel like everything that's happening now has illustrated that really powerfully for people. And so I no longer have to do as much convincing on that argument. People realize how much these spaces affect us.
Right. And I mean, in so many different aspects, and maybe it would be fun to tease some of those out. I think for me personally, one of the things that is just the most kind of salient comes down to mental health. So, as somebody who works in a mental health field, because I'm working on my PhD now, finally, went back to school in clinical psych, but also as somebody who has been on the other side of the couch, as it were, and has been a patient. Coping or living with major depressive disorder for most of my life, I always felt very strongly and have always been very passionate about interior design, interior organization, kind of a clean, minimalist lifestyle. And it really, I've always argued that the way my home looks, like from an aesthetic perspective, actually has a massive influence on my mood, my depression, my anxiety level, things of that nature. But I've struggled historically with whether or not that is an evidence-based viewpoint, whether or not that is just kind of like a justification or something more superficial that I like to tell myself. But it's nice to see that more and more we're understanding that your surroundings have a massive impact on your psychological well-being, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the factors and elements of your indoor environment, there's a lot more research behind certain interventions and design factors than others.
Okay.
And some of it is personal. So I don't know, at least of any study that says, the best style of decor for productivity is mid-century modern.
Right.
Like that's a matter of personal taste. But there are some broader ideas that there's a lot of research support for. And in terms of mental health and mood, two of the best things you can do in your space, whether that's your home or your office, are to bring in more daylight and to bring in more nature in some way. And both of those interventions have a lot of research support, like hundreds of studies. That is not controversial. And so when people ask me for tips on what they should be doing in their home, I tend to stay away from, well, paint your living room blue, and say more, bring in as many plants as you can, open your shades, open your curtains.
Right. So, yeah, it's like those things are sort of less subjective. Being in the dark with kind of nothing green is probably not, unless, there may be outliers where
Right.
for whom that's a really important step for their mental health. But in terms of, yeah, I think there's a lot of pop psychology out there that you have to be pretty careful with that like borders on pseudoscience, having to do with like color theory or having to do with, like you said, design aesthetic. I was wondering though, did you come across anything in your research simply about organization or about, kind of like calm versus very busy aesthetics?
A little bit. So that is
Okay.
definitely in the category of not overwhelming scientific evidence,
Right.
but there are some interesting hints, and especially when you start thinking about individual differences. So what the studies that I'm aware of at least show so far is that some people are much more sensitive to clutter and disorganization than others. So again,
Mm-hmm.
it's not that it's necessarily bad for everyone, but there's one interesting study that introverts are much more susceptible to distraction than
Right.
extroverts. And so whether that's visual distraction or noise in an open office, that's one category of people who might find clutter more disturbing. There's also some work on ADHD that shows that a more streamlined space, particularly workspaces, are better for performance and cognitive functioning. I don't know. I'm not sure I've come across anything on mood, but that would be something really interesting to explore.
Right. And I think, yeah, the introversion thing really seems to ring true, at least with my N of one,
Right.
right? My
Well,
anecdotal
N of
experience
two,
just
because
says,
I'm just
yeah,
like that.
there you
Yeah.
go. Perfect. Yeah. Just this idea. I often, if there are any noise distractions, I typically have to wear noise canceling headphones. If I listen to music at all while I'm working, it's going to be incredibly soothing ambient music with like no real kind of pulse to it. Definitely no lyrics. I have no idea how people, and I've never understood how people can like say, I'm going to go to a coffee shop and write.
Right.
Like, what?
Yep.
How? So yeah, so it's interesting that it's not just kind of auditory noise, but also maybe visual noise that can contribute to some of that discomfort or that, I don't know, that heightened awareness.
Yeah, there are definitely
Yeah.
hints of that in the literature, but
Mhm.
for sure.
But not quite as strong as some of the other literature about nature, bringing kind of the indoor outdoor lifestyle a little bit.
Right, right. And, the good news I tell people, well, so to back up, one thing that I have really changed about my own indoor space since I
Mm.
started writing this book is just that nature. I had a few houseplants here and there, but I really love having them. And, seeing the literature really just reinforced my pre-existing biases on that. So I now have maybe 24 houseplants around
Oh,
my one
wow.
bedroom apartment. And so when people ask me, I really strongly recommend plants. But the other reassuring thing is that, it's okay if you have a black thumb or if, keeping plants alive is not your thing, because studies suggest that sort of quote unquote fake nature, whether that is a fake plant or a big photo on the wall of some natural setting, or even, recordings of natural sounds like birdsong and babbling brooks, those can have a lot of the same mood boosting and stress relieving benefits as real plants. So there are a lot of different ways to try and bring those natural elements into your space.
Oh my gosh, I love that because my like $20 IKEA Monstera plants that are made of plastic never die
Yep.
and they're really beautiful.
Yeah.
And I love them so much. But, I live in a house where I just don't get as much light as I would like because of how my house faces the sun and because of the other buildings around me. And you, of course, live in New York. So you yourself understand this, or at least most of your neighbors do, that sometimes you do have to fake it. Like the only plants living in my house are on my kitchen windowsill. All of my succulents,
Yeah.
they seem to do okay. And then I have a robot garden in my kitchen.
What is a robot garden?
It's amazing. It uses pods. You just fill it with water. It
Oh,
does everything itself. And then I
nice.
get fresh peppers. And yeah, it's great.
During the quarantine, I've gotten super into microgreens, which was not something I knew anything about in March.
Smart. Yeah.
And they're really, I recommend them for people who, maybe don't have outdoor space but want to grow something edible, because they're really low maintenance. They're really fast, which is great for me because I'm kind of impatient. Like a week after I plant them, I can have microgreens for dinner. So if people out there are looking for a good starter gardening project, I definitely recommend microgreens.
Oh, I love that. And that's another way to, because it's interesting that there's so many components, and we won't make the whole episode about plants, but there's so many components just to having living organisms in your home, and like macroorganisms, because we'll get to the microorganisms.
Right.
Is that you said, it's kind of the fake version might still give you the same um, outcome in terms of just, looking at or hearing nature and getting that calming kind of meditative effect. But also the tending to nature must have a positive benefit, right? Like being involved in the growth and maintenance.
Yeah, and actually, some of my favorite research on that actually comes from space and space crews.
Huh.
The Russian space program in particular has been really sort of pro plant, and even starting in the 80s, when I guess it was the Soviet program, there were always greenhouses on the missions they sent up. And I believe they still have, the Russian side of the ISS has a greenhouse, and sort of tending to plants is something that has been therapeutic to cosmonauts. I think that astronauts and cosmonauts have even been encouraged to go, garden if during times of stress or
Right.
interpersonal tension. There's sort of a way in which that's a soothing, meditative escape. And the other thing I've been thinking about, because I feel like it's really relevant to what we're going through now, is that at least on space missions, plants often are a way of marking time. So you can see, like you plant a seed and then the next day it's germinated and the next day it's sprouted. And that resonates with me right now, because I get up in the morning and I come look at my fast growing microgreens, and there's something satisfying about seeing, it's a little taller than it was yesterday. And there's this way in which it, when everything feels out of time and disconnected from our normal schedules, there's something soothing about seeing like, okay, well, the plants keep growing in a predictable way.
Right. And so it's like this time demarcation, and you almost add to that like a reconnection to some sort of, I don't know, global or kind of human um core, where a lot of people are feeling like they're very disconnected right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about being engaged with nature, even if you've brought that nature indoors, which, I mean, there's got to be a reason that it's become like basically baking bread and growing green things has become like the pastime of bored housewives across
Right.
across the coronavirus pandemic. Like there's just something about reconnecting to that maybe is giving a little bit of a psychological reconnection to kind of society again in a way.
Yeah, and maybe to like systems that are larger than ourselves, and
Right. Yeah.
anchoring you back into larger ecosystems and things that are beyond
Right.
us.
Exactly, because we think of our houses as these, I mean, once you start to back out of it, it's such an interesting perceptual shift. That's a very quick and easy perceptual shift to do, is like when you're indoors, whether it's your apartment, your house, whether it's, a studio apartment in the middle of New York or a farmhouse in the middle of a rural area, like this is your space. You've put your mark on it. It's filled with your things. There are boundaries, and outdoors is outside and indoors is inside. But then when you start to really shift back, you can see that everybody has their own little space, and there are all these little demarcated spaces that are built within nature as a whole, right? And so like we're all kind of in a way shielding ourselves from nature, but we're also protecting ourselves. So you've got this strange kind of aspect where your home is like the most comfortable place.
Mm-hmm.
Like, every time you leave town, every time you have to be away for a while, like you just desperately want to be back at home, sleeping in your own bed,
Right.
having the familiar creature comforts. But when you spend too long in your own home, you start to feel a little stir crazy.
Absolutely. Yes.
You got to find that balance.
Yeah. And, one of the sort of speaking on a larger, more holistic level beyond just, plants and greenery, one of the things that ties a lot of the research findings together is that one way to create a healthy indoor environment is to figure out ways to let in elements of the outdoor environment. So nature is part of that, but, daylight is another part of that, which I mentioned earlier. So is fresh air. So is letting in, environmental microbes, maybe soil and water microbes from outside. So in a lot of ways, the more we can sort of bring in some of these elements into our interior spaces, the healthier those spaces will be.
It's so interesting because there is definitely, and I'm sure that this is like deeply culture bound as well. But so I don't want to about it as if it's fully universal. But let's say in Western society, we often will see this interest or this need to kind of make the indoor environment, and whether we're talking about our home or our workspaces or even public spaces, kind of hermetically sealed. And it's almost the opposite of what we should be doing. Like the second a single insect is detected, it's like, my space is contaminated. I must remove the intruder, as opposed to this sort of ecologically friendly space where, you have your comforts of your air conditioning or whatever to make it so that you're more secure, but also that nature can kind of flow through. We don't often think about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that's worth keeping in mind too in these, times of COVID-19. I know there's a temptation out there, and I feel it sometimes myself, to just, Clorox the hell out of your whole living space. Right. But, that's probably not good for us for a variety of reasons, partly because we don't want to eradicate all of the life and the microbes that are in our homes. A lot of them are benign and some of them are even beneficial. But then you also have air quality issues where you don't want, aerosolized disinfectant hanging around in your air all the time either. So it's a delicate balance.
Yeah, it's true. Like there are certain standards, right? Like building standards, depending on, what country you live in, what state you live in terms of airflow, and there not being kind of stale pockets and things like that. But if you live in a very old building, or if you live in a building that is basically just was hacked together, a lot of people live in non-permitted places, or, bare minimum standards may still not equate with like kind of ideal health. There's actually a lot of influence that the way that the air sits in your space can actually influence your health, can't it?
Yeah. And that's something that I think one of the areas people are paying more attention to with the coronavirus, because increasing ventilation, and a particular kind of ventilation too, is really important for sort of reducing transmission of the virus. And so when I say a particular kind of ventilation, there's sort of two ways you can ventilate a space. You can either recirculate air, and often those systems will have filters that are, designed to filter out pollutants or pathogens, or you can exhaust it into the outdoors. And definitely recirculation is inferior. When you want to be able to send more of your indoor air into the outdoors and bring in a constant supply of fresh air. And that's something you can do through, commercial buildings. It's usually done like through HVAC systems and settings, but at home, it's really as simple as opening a window. That can have huge benefits for air quality and reduce not just the risk of coronavirus, but reduce your exposure to pollutants and other nasty things that might be in your air.
Right. That's pretty low tech,
right.
but in a very easy way to do it. And it's funny because I think sometimes we get this sensibility that, like, especially those of us who live in big cities, you're in New York, I'm in LA, that like inside is always cleaner and safer than like the smoggy city air out there. But there is also kind of a reason that we're now starting to understand more and more. The highest infection rates of coronavirus are occurring in closed spaces where people have, are having conversations or they're breathing each other's air. And the safest way to have a socially distant interaction with human beings is to do it outside.
Absolutely. And actually, one of the things that I found really fascinating is that the idea that outdoor air is dirty and smoggy and the source of pollution is actually really outdated. And that's because there have been pretty effective federal regulations over the last few decades that have really cleaned up our outdoor air through things like, cleaner vehicle technology and reduced carbon emissions. But there are no federal regulations that govern our indoor air. And so for a lot of people, sort of our exposures have flipped. And in most places, unless you live in an exceptionally polluted city, the outdoor air, the air outside your home is going to be cleaner and less polluted than the air inside your home. And I think that comes as a real surprise to a lot of people.
Absolutely. I mean, because air quality is one of those interesting things where we can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
It looks fine unless you're looking. And the thing is, when you're in LA and you're looking at the horizon and you're like, wow, it's so smoggy, it's because you're able to see, tens to even hundreds of miles. And so you've got this accumulation of like kind of visual data. Whereas indoors, you're never going to have smog.
Right.
It's just the rooms aren't big enough to see it. And so it looks clear. It smells good inside. So like, what do I have to worry about? But of course, what are some of these sources in our own homes? Is it like commercial products that are outgassing? Is it, our own skin cells and our own bacteria, our pets, our roommates? What's contributing to the inside of our houses being kind of more polluted than outside?
Well, the short answer is all of the above.
Okay.
So, consumer products, everything from our furniture to our electronics, as you said, they outgas all sorts of compounds. And there's still a lot of things we don't know about those compounds. Sort of as a class, they're often known as VOCs or volatile organic compounds. And some of them seem to be health risks, and some of them we don't really know enough to say one way or the other. So that's one source. And then the activities we perform in our home is another source. And interestingly, there are two activities in particular that really generate a lot of air pollution, and that is cooking and cleaning. And the reason I think that's so interesting is because that's something that I think a lot of people have been doing more of both of those things since we've been locked down at home. And there's actually some preliminary data to suggest that the air quality in our homes has gotten worse since lockdowns went into effect, in part because of all that cooking and cleaning we're doing.
Wow. So even if you're like me and you live in a place where it's like crazy hot outside and, opening my windows in the middle of the day feels like, why would I do that? I love my air conditioner.
Right.
Maybe at least while you're cooking or while you're cleaning, opening up a few windows could be beneficial.
Absolutely. Or if you have, and some sort of exhaust fan. We don't have a range hood in our kitchen. It's an old stove, but we do have just a window fan in the window. And when we cook, I turn on the fan and make sure it's set to exhaust. So it's, expelling any of the polluted air out into the streets of New York, which maybe isn't great. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, it gets diluted really fast in the outdoors. So, I mean, if people have exhaust fans and range hoods, that's the other thing, is they should use them. A lot of people don't use them consistently because they're loud or, it uses energy, but really they can be pretty effective. And so I'd encourage people to turn them on if they're lucky enough to have them.
Right. And use it while you're cleaning. See, I never even thought about that. I always use the range hood exhaust fan, which does vent to the outside, not just into like an attic space like some people's do.
Right.
And I always use that when I'm cooking, like every single time, just because I think it looks cool how even the steam off of the boiling water like gets sucked into it. But I never even thought to turn it on when I'm, spraying down my countertop, which is like obvious.
Well,
do that too.
There's another very simple trick. I feel like it's one of those internet ads, or it's, like one simple trick for, but so there's this really interesting study that shows that actually you're a lot better off from an air pollution perspective if you cook on your back burners. And that's because most range hoods entirely cover the back burners, but only partially cover the front burners. And so they found that when people cook on the back burners, the exhaust fans actually capture about twice as much of the pollutants. So,
though, and I never do that. I always cook on the front. Probably because I don't have kids.
Well, and it's
like
convenient.
I've never had to think about it.
Like it's easier to
right there.
Yeah, it's easy. I don't have super long arms. It's easier to see what's in the skillet when it's right in front of you. But that's another sort of super easy change that people can make if that's something they're concerned about.
Oh, that's so smart. And so, and also like, turn on the burner or turn on the exhaust fan, even when you're just using the oven or when you're like, you just don't think about that. Okay. I love this. Oh my gosh. This is like news you can use.
Exactly.
And so, all right. So we've been talking a lot about our own homes, and probably just because it's very, very relevant right now because most people are staying home, but, maybe I shouldn't even say most. I feel like I've been kind of just throwing that out a lot in casual conversation. Like most people are at home right now. Most people are, but there's still a lot of people who have essential jobs who are going into work, whether they work in healthcare, whether they work in janitorial services, different kind of support services. And of course, people got to eat. A lot of restaurants are still open and doing, carry out or window service. So maybe we can broaden the conversation a little bit to commercial buildings or, the types of places where people are spending time, but they don't necessarily have a lot of volitional control over their space.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe I can change my cubicle, but I can't change the HVAC system of this giant building that I'm living in.
Right.
I'm wondering what some of the more interesting maybe things you didn't quite know or things that were counterintuitive that you came across when you were starting to learn more about the great indoors from a commercial perspective.
In terms of the pandemic or just sort of more broadly?
Even before, after, eventually, yes, there will be a new normal and it might not be the same as it was before, but people will be getting back to work who aren't already there. And some people are already there. So just interesting things about commercial spaces that you came across that maybe are different than what it's like in your home, because not everything quite translates the same, right?
Right. I mean, and one of the big challenges with commercial spaces or offices or hospitals or, basically anywhere that's not a private home is that you have lots of different people who have different sensitivities and different needs. And, you can get everything in your home just the way you like it, but that's not possible in an office.
Right. And lest you lose all your office friends.
Yes, exactly. Well, maybe it's possible in an office if you're like the CEO, but for most of us, it is not possible. And, one thing that fascinated me that I had not thought much about was the impact of air temperature, which is something that people who have worked in offices often have a lot of complaints about. I know I have often found offices to be freezing. And I know a lot of other women who have too. And it turns out, that's not an accident, that women tend to prefer air temperatures that are slightly warmer than men, which isn't that surprising. But
they tend to have less control over the temperature.
Well, so office temperatures are often calibrated to what men find comfortable. But what I found fascinating was that there's actually research that shows that women actually even perform better on cognitive tasks when the air is warmer. So it's not just a question of comfort, that the temperature we have our offices set to might actually be impairing women's performance and productivity. There's just a real sex-based difference in what temperatures we find comfortable and productive. And so that's something that I think often goes sort of unappreciated or unseen, but can have a real impact on how we work.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, like you said, I think a lot of times it does feel anecdotal. It feels like this thing where a lot of women who have worked in offices are like, oh yeah, I know about that. That's why there's a cardigan on the back of my chair.
Right,
That's why I've always got to bring a hoodie to the office. And it is frustrating, but to know that there is some good evidence behind that individuals are starting to really research this from a scientific perspective, I think I don't know, it's validating.
It is, yeah. And it's something that researchers are beginning to seek solutions to as a problem that is worth solving. I wrote about an interesting sort of small project, but an app called Goldilocks that a designer developed. And it was sort of based on the premise that we have all of this data about the outdoor world in general, like on our phones. You can see when the next bus is coming, you can see what the weather is, you can see what the air quality is, but that our buildings in some ways are still sort of black boxes. Like if you asked, what the temperature was in my kitchen versus my bedroom, like I couldn't tell you.
Right. You'd be like hotter.
Yeah, exactly. But he developed this app that basically maps all of that stuff for his architectural firm's office. So it will show you, this room over here right now is dark and cool, and this room over here is loud and cool, and then there's like a warmer but shady spot, and people can get real-time readouts on the conditions inside their offices. There are also motion detectors installed, so people can see if like a space they like to work in is occupied. And then they can move to the kind of space that best fits their needs or serves them what they want in that moment. And so that's a high-tech way of doing it. But what it comes down to, and sort of my advice for people who are setting up office spaces or other communal spaces, is that in some way you really want to allow choice and control. So create sort of different kinds of micro environments, whether that's, different temperatures and noise levels, but also, maybe a row of desks in one area, but more casual, lounge, couch-like seating somewhere else, and empower workers and occupants to move to the spaces that work best for them. And it's not always going to be the same, right? So like someone might want to do really concentrated work in a small, quiet, closed room in the morning, and then hang out with their colleagues and brainstorm in the more casual environment in the afternoon. So really allowing a lot of choice and control over the spaces we occupy is the sort of big solution there.
Right. And I find myself doing that in my home spaces, as well. And it makes sense that would obviously translate. But I think a lot of people don't feel empowered unless they work, sort of like you mentioned, in a firm that has maybe a little bit more like a tech savvy firm who's like, ahead of the curve.
Right.
And they've got these weird pods and they've got like beanbag chairs and foosball tables and stuff like that. It actually can not just increase productivity, but increase kind of a sense of psychological well-being at work that makes you, like, it puts you in a better mood, which of course has like probably measurable, but also immeasurable benefits to everything from productivity just to general kind of like worker satisfaction.
Yeah, and there are studies that now demonstrate that workers that have more control over their own working environment have higher workplace satisfaction, which, is not rocket science, so to speak. But I think sometimes managers and, building operators might not really believe something until they see it mapped out in that way.
Right. Yeah. Until you've got the like data that you can run up the flagpole. It's true. I think about just the way that I'm operating in my space. I've been lucky enough that I carve out a podcast studio, which has all of the acoustics and the things that I need to be sitting here and recording with you right now. But then my office space is separate, where I've got a big oversized like recliner with a big fuzzy blanket, and that's where I do my reading. And then I might move to my desk to actually physically write because I want to be sitting more upright to write, but I'm not going to sit there and read at my desk. Like, that's weird. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, and I can go to my roof and sit outside if I need some vitamin D.
Yes.
Having that indoor-outdoor aspect too to the office spaces can be really important. It's amazing to me how many people never leave the office once they come in the morning until they leave at night.
Right. And
it's like just going outside for lunch or going outside to like, do a team meeting outdoors if you have that capability can be amazing.
And that's something that I think more people should really be thinking about, especially in our pandemic times, because of what we talked about earlier about how much less likely the diseases to spread outdoors, that, if you're in a climate where it's possible, having meetings outdoors, even, as schools, or if schools start back up in the fall, like when the weather's nice, teach class outdoors. Those things, we know that that's good for attention and mood and stress relief, but it's also good from a disease transmission point of view. So I think really thinking creatively about how we can move some of society's sort of essential functions and routines outdoors, as long as weather makes that possible, that's going to be really important in the months ahead.
So, two places that you write about in your book that are very different, but in some ways I see a lot of parallels that we haven't touched on yet that I would like to be able to dive into, are two places that you don't really have a choice to go there, and that would be the hospital and prison. So these are two areas where a real lack of independence, a real lack of volition, and a sense of, I don't know, self-worth. These are big hurdles that a lot of people have when they are spending time, I should say, as a patient, not as somebody who works in a hospital setting or works in a prison setting. So as a patient or an incarcerated person, you don't have control. And that said, that's, I think, just exacerbates some of these difficulties of the indoor space, is that you are there kind of like against your will oftentimes. And you're there because of, or maybe because of isn't the right word to use, but like you're there due to something not good happening in your life,
Right. I mean, the occupants of those
thing.
Yeah, the occupants of those buildings are often very vulnerable in some way, or
Yes,
whether it's
absolutely.
physically, medically, psychologically, and they're often sort of what one researcher described to me as sort of quote unquote total environments, especially prisons, but also if you're a hospital inpatient, it's not a place you're coming into in the morning and then clocking out of at night. Like you're stuck there. Until
and
you
if you're not well enough to be able to go outside, or to be, and most programs might not even allow that. But like sometimes not just are you stuck there, you're stuck in one room, you're stuck in one bed, and you haven't left that environment for days, weeks, when we're talking about prison, years. So what were some of the interesting things that you learned I think there's the obvious stuff about, well, that sucks,
right.
chapter over, but obviously there's a lot more to it than that. There are ways that these types of things can be, these types of buildings can be thought about anew, that can maybe not solve completely, but mitigate some of these concerns.
Yeah, I mean, and when we talk about prisons, one of the ideas that I found really interesting was that the environments we build and the spaces we build, they communicate something, and they communicate our values, like who and what do we think is important, and they communicate our expectations. And so there's research that suggests that creating sort of what you might, I don't love this word, but what you might think of as like a quote unquote softer correctional environment, that people who are incarcerated actually behave better, that they're less violent, that they're less stressed. And one possible explanation is because of the expectations that these environments create. So, if you have a space that's all metal bars and all the furniture is stainless steel and it's bolted down to the ground, I mean, that sort of sends the signal that you can't be trusted. We expect you to try to destroy things. We're treating you essentially like a zoo animal.
That's what I was thinking. There's a subhuman kind of component to it. Yeah, it's dehumanizing.
It is dehumanizing. But creating what sort of some researchers refer to as a more normalized environment, where maybe you have, it sounds stupid because it's such a small thing, but like an actual like upholstered couch or armchair, and you maybe have actual lamps with light bulbs that you can screw in and screw out. That communicates that we trust you and that you're a human being, and we're trying to create, something resembling a home-like environment for you, and that people tend to behave better in those environments. We get those messages, and they can be really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way that you even worded it, that it's communicating sort of the expectation or the purpose that's built into the design. And you can really tell when you visit one of these places and you spend time there, the difference. Because on paper, you can say whatever you want. But then when you actually go into one of these built environments, you can tell the difference between a program whose central goal is rehabilitation and a program whose central goal is warehousing. There's a big difference, and you can see it. I mean, those decisions directly translate to the experience of the individual who's spending time there.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that it's not just, prisons are extreme environments sort of by definition, which is one reason I was interested in them. But the same lessons apply. And there's a really interesting study I talk about of teenagers in public schools. And researchers found that kids that go to schools that are better maintained and sort of where the buildings are higher quality don't just do better, but they have more sort of self-belief or self-confidence in their ability to achieve. And, her explanation is that because the building is sending them a message that like you matter and your education matters, and we take this seriously, where you can imagine going to a rundown school where, they don't bother to fix basic, broken lockers or, and I know in some cases or a lot of cases, maybe there are budgetary limitations on that, but that sends sort of a different message about how important you might be and how important school might
Right.
be.
Yeah, it really does contribute to feelings of self-efficacy. And I mean, we can look at extreme examples, let's say at a university level. We've all seen films, not, I've never stepped foot in a place like this, but I've definitely seen it in movies where you've got like Ivy Leaguers, in these like lush libraries with leather
Right.
and like upholstery. And you're like, what is this immaculate place?
Yeah.
And then, I went to state school and I loved my school, and my school was actually, I think, really functional, but it didn't look like that. It didn't have a home-like vibe
Right.
in the classroom, and that I could see that really contributing to sometimes these very potentially damaging psychological experiences of people saying, okay, well, this is how my educational institution sees me. This is how much worth I have in society. And that's not the only piece of evidence, but it contributes to obviously evidence in every aspect of your life. That's either I'm marginalized, I'm disenfranchised, I am less than, or I deserve this, I am important. This is the way society should treat me. And I think that translates to a lot of interesting psychological outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, and it's something I've been thinking about again in terms of the pandemic. Like, if you think about
Mm-hmm.
where the real super spreader events, hotspots have been, they have been in prisons, they have been in nursing homes, they have been in
Right.
meatpacking plants and in homeless shelters. And like, I don't think it's an accident that these are environments that tend to house people who are marginalized in some way or vulnerable in some way. Like, there's a reason that these environments, we haven't put as much into ensuring that they're safe.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's it's incredibly unfortunate because it doesn't just translate to, some sort of thought experiment. These are real lives. And I think that more and more people are seeing now that there's a direct public health aspect to this. So even if you are in a position, kind of a narcissistic position, to be able to say, I don't see it, I don't think about it, it doesn't affect me. Well, it does affect you.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
that's such an important thing to remember.
there's the case of Singapore, which thought it had the virus licked until it realized that it was facing these huge outbreaks in the dorms, the overcrowded dorms for migrant workers. And so, like, if you don't take care of your most vulnerable citizens, it has ramifications for everybody.
Right. Yeah. Nobody is immune. I
Right.
mean, that is the whole point of this
Right.
virus, is that it's novel, right? And
Yeah.
we have no idea how we're going to experience it. And so for sure, like we as a nation are only as strong as the weakest among us. And, it really does reflect how we take care of our most vulnerable individuals. And I love that that's something that you really did tap into in a book that feels like topically, it could be very far away from any sort of like social consequence or social commentary. All of these conversations are important. This book isn't just about how rich people can feel happy in their homes,
Right.
It's about how can the indoor built environment be the healthiest and the most, I don't know, there's so many adjectives you could plug into that, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that is one of my big takeaways. And, if you ask me what message I hope readers leave with, it's that we now have a lot of evidence. There are a lot of questions, but we still have a lot of evidence about how to create healthy indoor spaces. And so it's no longer just a matter of knowledge, it's a matter of political will. And is this something we're going to
Right.
prioritize? And is this something that we want to make a focus and something that we really invest in? We have the tools to create better spaces if we want to do that.
And what I love so much, there's almost like a weird irony in the fact that we spend so much of our lives indoors, as a culture, as a society, as an kind of the human being who has evolved through hundreds of thousands of years has continuously kind of built up, the fortress-like home, the thick walls or the fences. And of course, again, that's a very Western perspective. Not every human society does that at all. But this very strange kind of irony that the more that we try to separate ourselves from nature, the more the takeaway becomes, well, what's the healthiest way to live? Bring in that nature.
Right.
Open up them windows. Not sure what you've been trying to do to separate yourself for so long. The more we do that, kind of the less healthy or beneficial it becomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another lesson. Trying to figure out how to not have it both ways, but to strike the right balance in terms of, we are going to live indoors. We are essentially an indoor species. Like there's no changing that. But how can we incorporate the best parts of the outdoor world into our buildings?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it could be easy to take the commentary too far, but there's a reason that like shelter we think of as a basic right.
Right.
It's like we do need shelter. And there's a reason that sadly, even when you walk the streets of Skid Row in Los Angeles or you look at different homeless encampments or tent cities, people are living in tents. Like we still have to shield ourselves from the elements. It's the only way that we're going to survive. But once you've shielded yourself from the most extreme environments, allowing the more, I guess, neutral environments in to be a little bit more homeostatic seems like it does have better outcomes, not just for your psychological health, but your actual physical health as well.
Right. I mean, it's about finding ways to maintain some links to, the environment that we evolved in. Like obviously the world is different and we are different, but we're not that different. And so we still need the links to, whether it's microbes or plants or whatever it is.
Oh, I love that. Well, gosh, Emily, okay, I have like some closing questions that I ask everybody who comes on the show because I think it's like a fun experiment to compare everybody's answers. Although I've never physically done anything with it. I think it's gotten to the point where it's just expected by my listeners, and we all love to hear what everybody says. But one of these days, maybe I will actually clip out everybody's answers and do a special episode of that.
Oh, that'd be
but
cool.
Before we get into that kind of closing segment, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you covered in the book that you feel like is important, or anything that you were you had in your mind? Okay, we've got to make sure we mention this that we didn't.
Not that comes immediately to mind. I mean, I do get a bit more forward looking at the very end, and I look at how we can, if we settle space, what will those shelters look like? And I think the interesting opportunity there is to sort of do just what I was talking about. It's, an opportunity almost to start from scratch. And so to take everything that we've learned, and, these environments, on Mars or the moon or wherever it is are very different. But we as humans, as Homo sapiens, will not be that different. So we will still need to create structures that serve our basic human needs. And it's an opportunity to sort of apply all the best of what we've learned. So I think that's sort of a fun thought experiment, how we would do that. But I will leave that as a teaser for anyone who might want to check out the book.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it definitely makes sense. It kind of, in some ways, reminds me, in other ways it doesn't, but of these concepts of areas that are kind of less developed from an infrastructure perspective that are just starting to get more modern infrastructure online, like maybe really rural areas and sometimes in developing nations where we're kind of in a good position where the people who live there can skip some of the trial and error, really dirty crap. Like, let's just not even bother with coal-based infrastructure. Let's just move straight to a solar kind of infrastructure. Or let's not, waste our time with this thing that's actually going to make us ill if we can build it right from the beginning and we can, like you said, benefit from all the trial and error. Like, let's not be conservative in our approach just because it feels comfortable. Let's do what we know works better.
Right.
I love that. So good. Okay, great. So before we dive into the last two questions, I want to remind people again, the book is The Great Indoors, The Surprising Science of How Buildings Shape Our Behavior, Health, and Happiness. And of course, science journalist Emily Anthes. I would love, or is it Anthes or Anthes?
Anthes.
They say it wrong.
No, it doesn't.
Anthes,
Doesn't matter.
And I always hate it when people mispronounce my name, so I'm super weird about not wanting to mispronounce other people's names. So let's talk about the closing questions that I always ask my guests on the show. So they're two questions and they're big picture questions. And as a science journalist and author, I know you've thought about these big pictures and I'd love to hear your take. So we're going to start with the one that's maybe more depressing. And that is, when you think about the future, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? The thing that you're most concerned about? Like, we could be talking, I don't know, pessimistic, cynical, even. What's not looking good? What are you really concerned about? And then on the flip side of that, the second question, so we can end on a slightly more positive note, is the flip side of that. When you think about the future, what are you genuinely, kind of authentically optimistic about and really looking forward to?
Ooh, those are big questions.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm most pessimistic about and what I despair about when I look at our current moment, but even, the last few years or decade, is sort of the rejection of some sort of absolute truth, or,
Right.
which accompanies sort of, I guess, the rejection of expertise. Like, I feel like there used to be plenty of disagreement on policy or solutions or, the right direction for the world, but that for the most part, people could all agree on sort of an underlying reality. And the fact that that no longer seems possible is really scary to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ugh. And it's not like an intellectual exercise, like a philosophical one, right? It's not that we're arguing sometimes about a more postmodern or constructivist view of okay, through your indigenous lens or your, specific cultural lens, your interpretation is slightly different than mine because of XYZ. Is that they're basic, fundamental kind of human morals that people disagree about.
Yeah, but even basic questions of is there a dangerous virus that is a threat to all of our health, circulating right now? The fact that that's not an obvious point of agreement for 100% of people is, I don't know how you build any sort of common ground if you can't establish a set of common facts.
Yeah, it's such a scary thing. I think that, I was just talking about this on the other show that I work on, SGU, this past week. People were saying, how do we make people realize? And it's I think the sad thing is that passively, if it's not happening to me, it's not happening, is going to change when it's happening to me. And we're getting to a point with viral load and viral saturation and just the sheer death count that we're looking at across the globe that soon someone's going to know somebody. Right now, someone knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, but eventually, it's going to be in your backyard. And it is easier to deny things when they don't affect us personally. And I think that's why so much of the most recent wave of the Black Lives Matter protests have been so powerful, is that it's just too hard to live your kind of privileged, hermetically sealed bubble and not see it for what it is. And more people who could comfortably be passively contributing to a racist society are now realizing, nope, I got to be anti-racist, and I got to do it in a really active way because I'm complicit, and this world is not safe for a huge group of people, and that's not okay. So yeah, the sad thing is, I think that sort of denial of reality, there's always going to be a percentage of people who deny it even when it's right in their face, but there's a narcissism or like an individualistic exceptionalism that's like, well, because it doesn't affect me personally, it doesn't affect me. It doesn't even exist. And that's rough.
Yeah.
We saw it with flu denial. I mean, we still do, but I'm always amazed by how many people are like, well, people don't actually die of the flu. I've never met someone who died of the flu. And it's like, okay, cool. Yeah, that's rough. So there's got to be, though, a silver lining, or maybe it's a completely different topic. Like, what are you genuinely looking forward to?
Well, I don't know if looking forward to is the right way to put it, but in terms of like optimism, and maybe this is sort of short term and influenced by just what's been going on, in the last month or two, but like in some ways I have felt more hopeful in the last month than I did earlier this spring, just because seeing the energy that so many people still have to fight for change, even when it's, at their own personal risk, and the sacrifices that people are making to try to make things better and to make sure that the future is better than the past. I mean, it gives me hope how many people are doing that, and how they're doing it in such a sustained way. We have protests going by our apartment every day. We're, near the center of some of the New York protests, and it's hopeful. There's something, I mean, it's tragic and it's awful that it's necessary, but it's hopeful to me that it's happening.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not new, right? So yes, it's tragic and it's just horrific, but it's also the reality of life for so many individuals in this country, and has been since before they were born.
Right.
So it is really hopeful. I mean, to see that it's actually affecting change. I mean, that's what's so hopeful to me.
Right.
It's that we can measure real policy changes. I mean, there's still so much work to be done,
Yes.
and there's still so many places where it's like screaming into a void. But yeah, I'm excited to see how many people have really shown great resolve, great bravery in the face of a global pandemic, in the face of police brutality, in the face of, risking their careers, risking their livelihood, because this, not just political, but, human, very kind of human problem is just, it's too big to ignore.
Yeah. And
beautiful.
And seeing the changes in attitudes, the rapid changes in attitudes, especially among white people who are now, suddenly embracing anti-racism and willing to say Black Lives Matter. And, the suddenness, it's taken far too long, but the suddenness with which the change seems like it's happening now is a reason for hope, I think.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Well, gosh, Emily, this was such a fascinating chat. Thank you so much for taking the time to enlighten us all about the great indoors. I learned a lot.
Oh, thanks so much for your interest. And I hope everyone's doing well in their own indoor environments.
Absolutely. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.